Last winter, I decided to sell an expensive watch that I inherited from my grandfather. I put an ad up on Craigslist and got a few inquiries, but people were either lowballing me or asking me stupid questions, which made me think they weren't serious. One evening, I received a voicemail from someone named Alex who said he was interested and asked me to call him back to discuss details. I called him back the next day, and he seemed very eager. He agreed to my asking price without any haggling and suggested we meet in a Walmart parking lot to make the exchange. We agreed on a date and time for the meeting, and I was happy that I would get my initial asking price. On the day of the meeting, it was snowing pretty heavily. I arrived at the agreed location and waited in my car, scanning the lot for the buyer, but there was no sign of him. I tried calling him, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when I noticed a car parked a few rows away, with a man sitting inside just watching me. Something about it felt off, but I thought I'd approach him anyway and check if he's the buyer. I went up to the car and knocked on the window. The man rolled it down and asked me what I wanted. "Hi, are you Alex from Craigslist?"
"No, I'm not,"
he replied, and then rolled his window back up while giving me an annoyed look. I went back to my car and tried calling Alex again. He picked up this time and said that he couldn't make it today because of the snowstorm, then hung up, without even trying to arrange another meeting. I was really frustrated to have been waiting there almost an hour for nothing. I sat in the lot for a few minutes, while the man in the other car kept looking at me. He then picked up his phone and started talking to someone, while still staring at me. I was starting to get a bit weirded out, so I started driving home. As soon as I drove off, the other car drove off after me. As I made a few turns, I noticed that he's following me from a distance. It was starting to get dark, and the snow wasn't slowing down. I had about a 20-minute drive to my house, but with some random guy following me, I didn't want to drive straight home without knowing his intentions. I drove around town for a while, making random turns and hoping he'd let up. A few minutes later, I could no longer see him in my rearview mirror, so I decided to start heading home. I lived in a suburban house about 15 miles from the town where our meeting was. As I was driving home, the snow slowed down a bit, but there wasn't a living soul on the road. Halfway to my house, I noticed a car approaching quickly. As it got closer, I got a sick feeling in my stomach. It was the same weirdo from the parking lot who was following me earlier. He overtook me aggressively and stopped suddenly in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, trying not to crash into him, but couldn't stop in time and hit his rear bumper. He got out of the car, waving around a gun, then came up to my window and yelled at me to roll it down. I was in full-on panic mode. I didn't want to risk getting shot if I drove off, so I rolled down the window slightly and asked him what he wanted.
"Give me the watch and your phone, now!"
he yelled while pointing the gun at me. I realized that this whole thing was a setup, so I did what he asked. He grabbed them, got back in his car, and took off. I tried to see his license plate, but it was all iced up and covered with snow in a way that I couldn't read it. I was shaken and distressed, but I turned around and drove straight to the police station. I gave a statement and a description of the man, but unfortunately, in the coming days and weeks, nothing came of it. The police advised me not to sell expensive items on Craigslist ever again, because it attracted a lot of bad actors due to the anonymity of it. I guess I learned my lesson the hard way. I had been working as a food delivery driver for a couple of years, and I thought I had seen pretty much everything the job could throw at me. It was a typical Friday evening, and I was hustling to get as many orders delivered as I could. The tips were good that day, and I thought I'd do a few more deliveries before calling it a night. One order came in for a delivery to a part of town I wasn't very familiar with, It was a residential area, but more isolated than what I was used to. It had just started snowing pretty heavily before I picked up the food from the restaurant and headed out. I found the address using my phone, without much trouble. It was a large, but somewhat run-down house at the end of a dark street. The front yard was full of trash, and the house itself was poorly lit. I walked up to the front door with the food. The door was open a crack, which was odd. I rang the bell, but there was no answer. Pushing the door slightly, I called out, "Hello? Food delivery." Still no response. I was about to leave the food at the door and mark the delivery as completed when I heard a voice from inside the house.
Come in, we're in the back.
Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. Why would they be in the back of the house and leave the front door open? I hesitated, then decided to take a few steps inside to see if I could get a better view of the back area. As I stepped in, the floorboards creaked under my weight. The house was eerily quiet, and it was hard to see much in the dim light.
"Your food's here!"
I called out again, louder this time.
"Keep coming, we're all the way in the back."
I walked a few more steps, but my gut feeling was screaming that something was off. I noticed that the house seemed almost empty, with very little furniture and no personal items in sight. It looked more abandoned than lived in. Just then, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from somewhere ahead of me, like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite succeeding. That was the final red flag for me. I quickly turned around and headed straight for the door, picking up my pace. As I reached the front porch, I took a quick glance back and saw someone running down the hall towards me. I hurried to my car, locked the doors, and drove off as fast as I could. Once I was a safe distance away, I pulled over and tried to calm my racing heart. I called the police to report the incident, giving them the address and explaining what had happened. They told me they would check it out and thanked me for the information. For the rest of the night, I kept thinking about how close I had come to falling into what I was sure was a trap. I had no idea what was waiting for me in that house, but I was grateful that my instincts had kicked in when they did. The next day, I got an update from the police, and they informed me that the house was empty once they arrived, and nobody lived there. I don't know what whoever was hiding in the back had planned, but it was definitely a close call for me, and I'm lucky I got away in time. I am a nightscape photographer. I often go out to isolated places away from the light pollution of the city and take photographs of the night sky. It's peaceful, and I enjoy the solitude and quietness of the night. I usually go out during the summer and take pictures of the Milky Way. It's not as cold and the locations are more easily reachable. Also, where I am in the northern hemisphere, the Milky Way is only visible at a certain time of the year. Last winter, though, I decided to change things up and get some winter shots for a calendar I was working on at the time. I thought I'd try and take a photograph of the Orion constellation, which is only visible in the winter. There is a pine forest about 30 minutes away from my house. I went during the day to scout out some locations and make sure there was a trail I could follow near the road. I found a nice path, which led to an opening in the trees, where it looked perfect for me to take my shot. I went home, set up my gear, and waited for night to fall. At around 9 p.m., I packed my bag and left. I got to the location, parked near the trail on the side of the road, and started walking. I had a flashlight with me, so I took it and walked slowly through the snow. On the way, I thought I heard some branches and twigs breaking near me. I pointed my flashlight through the trees, but I didn't see anything. I thought that it's probably just a fox or something. I hadn't heard of bear or wolf sightings in that area, but I always carried a can of pepper spray with me just in case. I continued walking, and a few moments later I was at the location. I started unpacking my gear and setting up my camera when I heard something in the trees once again. This time, I thought I heard footsteps in the snow. I shined my flashlight in that direction and saw a figure of a man walking between the trees in the deep snow. There was nothing out there, and the path was quite far from where he was. When I shined my flashlight on him, the man stopped and turned his back towards me. I felt uncomfortable. The trail I was on wasn't very popular or anything, and it didn't make a lot of sense for someone else to be there at that time of the night. "Hello? How are you this fine evening?" I asked. He didn't reply. He stood there for a few seconds, his back still towards me, then started walking towards the path, in the direction I came from. A few moments later, he disappeared into the darkness. I wasn't thrilled to be there alone at that time of the night, especially knowing that there's someone else around, whose intentions I wasn't sure of. I had expensive camera equipment with me, so I was definitely uncomfortable. I decided to pack up my gear and go back to my car. I made my way back to the path and walked towards my car. As I walked through the snow, I saw the man standing in the middle of the path just ahead of me. This time, he was facing me. I stopped in my tracks and got a chill down my spine. The man was just staring at me, not moving or saying anything. I took the can of pepper spray out of my pocket and held it in my hand, expecting the worst. I had to get by the man in order to get back to my car, so I started walking slowly towards him. As I got closer to him, he put his hands in his pockets and said,
Out here all by yourself, huh?
"Yeah, just taking some photos. What brings you here?" I replied. He looked at me with a disturbed look on his face and said,
I'm looking for my wife. I think she's around here somewhere.
This creeped me out even more. I didn't see any cars near where I parked, and the path started there and ended at the opening in the trees where I was taking photos. "I haven't seen anyone," I replied. He looked down at my hands and saw me holding the can of pepper spray. Then he looked back at me with an angry look on his face. He stood there quiet for a few seconds, then turned around and walked off. I walked back to my car, but I didn't see the man again. I don't know where he went or where he came from. The place was quite isolated, and what made the encounter even creepier was that there was no way for anyone to get there without a car, and I didn't see any cars at all that night. As I drove back home, I couldn't help but wonder what he was planning to do to me that night, and why he was really there in the first place. I'm just glad that I got home safely. Back when I was in high school, I worked as a pizza delivery driver for Pizza Hut. It was a familiar routine for me, as I also had a part-time job at Subway on the weekends. I want to make it clear that I was no newbie to the world of food delivery, and what happened on this particular night was anything but typical. Normally, I didn't take phone orders. Someone else at the restaurant usually handled that, and I would just pick up the pizzas and deliver them. This time was no different. I had just completed a delivery and went back to the shop to grab the next one. However, as I was leaving, my coworker mentioned in passing to ensure the customer paid in full. It struck me as odd, because that was pretty obvious, but I was in a hurry due to the icy conditions outside, so I didn't dwell on it. Driving to the address, which was about a 15-minute drive from the shop, I mulled over why my coworker had said that. I assumed maybe the customer had a reputation for seeking discounts or something. It was around 10:30 p.m., and the roads were quiet, with snow gently falling. As soon as I left the parking lot, I noticed a car speeding up behind me. It closed in, then slowed to match my speed. I couldn't make out the make or model of the car, but it's not uncommon for people to drive fast late at night here. Still, given the snowy weather, speeding wasn't wise. I maintained my pace, hoping the driver would either pass me or turn off, but they stuck with me. At a traffic light, the car pulled up alongside me. I usually avoid eye contact at lights to skip awkward interactions, but the driver started shouting, trying to get my attention. Glancing over, I saw a man aggressively gesturing for me to roll down my window. I pretended to be busy with the pizza bag, ignoring him. Once the light turned green, I sped off, but the car kept pace, the man still trying to catch my eye. Feeling more irritated than scared, I contemplated turning onto a side street, but wasn't sure about the road conditions. I didn't want to risk getting stuck in the snow with this guy tailing me. Deciding to stick to the main road, I was just a minute away from the delivery address when the man's car suddenly swerved in front of me. I braked hard, skidding slightly on the icy road. Fortunately, the other car slid off the road into the snow, almost turning completely around. My heart was racing as I slowly drove past, seeing the car stuck in the snow. I felt a bit guilty leaving him there, but his intentions seemed far from good. I arrived at the customer's house and knocked several times. No answer. I called my boss, who then tried calling the customer, but there was no response. The house lights were on, adding to my confusion. Then it dawned on me. I quickly got back into my car and took a different route back to the shop. There, I explained everything to my boss. We both suspected the customer was the man in the car, his plan likely to get me to pull over so he could rob me. The fact that he wasn't at home, presumably because he got stuck in the snow, seemed to confirm our suspicions. My boss said he'd inform the police and provide them with the guy's number and address. He never followed up with me, so I'm not sure if he did, but we never heard from that customer again. Whether my theory was right or not, it was a night I won't easily forget, a reminder that a routine delivery job can sometimes turn into something much more unnerving. I was in my early 30s when something really scary happened during a walk with my dog Bella. I lived in a quiet suburb, usually a safe place for our nightly strolls, or so I thought. It was around 8 p.m. and everything was quiet, covered in snow. Bella and I set out for our usual walk around the neighborhood. Despite the cold, Bella was eager as ever, her tail wagging as we headed towards our favorite park. The neighborhood seemed more deserted than usual, maybe because of the cold. The snow had this way of making everything seem extra quiet, almost a bit eerie. Nearing the park, I noticed a car parked further down the street. It was a bit odd. All the lights were off, but I could make out some movement inside. As we walked by the car, I tried not to stare too much. From the corner of my eye, I could see someone in the driver's seat. It seemed like they were watching us. This made me feel slightly uncomfortable, but I brushed it off and kept walking. After passing the park, however, the car started up. I glanced back and saw it was now slowly following us. This got me worried. I quickened my pace, hoping it was just a coincidence, but the car stayed right behind us, its headlights eerily off. Starting to feel quite anxious, I decided to take a different turn, hoping to throw the car off. But the moment I switched streets, the car did the same. I held my phone tightly, ready to dial for help if things escalated. Bella, sensing my fear, stayed close. I remembered there was a shortcut nearby that would lead us to a more populated area, so we started walking in that direction. Then suddenly, the car accelerated, passing us and stopping a bit ahead. A tall man in a dark coat and beanie stepped out.
"Excuse me, can you help me? I'm lost,"
he called out, his voice too calm for the situation. Alarm bells rang in my head. I held Bella's leash tightly, took a few steps back, and told him I couldn't help. Then I turned and started walking the other way. The man got back into his car and started it up again. Filled with panic, I began to jog, Bella by my side. Looking back, I saw the car turn and start following us again. We ran towards the main road, hoping to find some open store or people. Bella barked as we ran. When we reached the main road, I saw the lights of a convenience store still on. I rushed in, catching my breath. The clerk looked surprised to see us in such a state, but quickly locked the door and called the police after I explained what happened. Through the store window, we saw the car drive past slowly and then speed off into the night. The police arrived and took my statement, but without a license plate or a better description of the man, they couldn't do much. They offered to drive us home. That night really shook me. I had always felt safe in our neighborhood, but this incident changed that. Since then, I've been more cautious, changing our walking route and keeping my phone ready. The memory of being followed in the snow, the fear, and the relief of reaching safety is something that stays with me. I work as a community patrol officer in a southern neighborhood of Cleveland. Just to clarify, my job isn't like being a cop or anything. I'm 28 and drive a small patrol vehicle around affluent neighborhoods to boost residents' sense of security. It's a common job here, with plenty of wealthy communities near some rougher city areas. My role includes reporting community violations, like overgrown bushes in neighborhoods with strict maintenance rules. It's a bit nitpicky for my taste, but hey, it's a job. I usually work the night shift, from 8 p.m. to 3 a.m. It's an unusual schedule, but that's just how it is. Up until this incident, the weirdest thing I'd encounter would be teenagers goofing off in the parks late at night. But last week, something happened that really shook me. It was around 10 p.m. and the roads were covered with snow. I pulled into a small parking lot to check out what I thought was a broken window on one of the stores. As I walked back to my car, I noticed a hooded figure sitting on a park bench not too far away. Hands in pockets, staring at the ground, just sitting in the snow. I thought maybe he was waiting for a drug dealer or something. I didn't linger, just got back in my car and continued my patrol. The community is large, so it takes about an hour to complete the patrol route. By the time I finished, it was nearing midnight. I was just driving around the neighborhoods when I found myself back near the park. The man on the bench was gone. Out of curiosity, I slowed down to see if he was nearby but didn't spot him. As I passed the dark, empty park, I couldn't shake off this weird feeling. Something just felt off. I kept driving, trying to ignore it, but then I pulled up to a stop sign and saw the same hooded man from earlier, as if he was about to cross the street. He walked into the road, then stopped and turned to face me. He came up to my window, asking for directions to a specific address. I cracked the window slightly and told him I didn't know. His reaction was odd. No emotion, just silence. Then he repeated his question. By now, I was feeling really uneasy. I quickly said I had to go, rolled up my window, and drove off. In my rearview mirror, I saw him just standing there in the snow, watching me leave. I parked down the road to gather my thoughts. The encounter was bizarre, but I wasn't sure if it warranted calling the police. I decided to look up the address he asked for. It was inside the neighborhood I was patrolling, just a few minutes away. Curious, I drove over to the address. The house looked like any other at 1 a.m., lights off, no one outside. I parked across the street and waited. Barely 30 seconds passed before the hooded man appeared, walking towards the house. He knocked on the door a few times, waited, then knocked again. After a minute, someone answered. Suddenly, the man forced his way inside, I was in shock. I quickly called the police but stayed in my car, too scared to intervene. For a few tense minutes, there was no movement. Then the front door burst open and the man sprinted away down the street. The police arrived 10 minutes later. The homeowner was found inside, unconscious from a brutal beating. The man hadn't stolen anything, and the homeowner didn't recognize him. It was bizarre. The attacker knew the address but seemed to have no motive other than violence. The whole situation was unnerving. It's only been a week since then. I hope more information surfaces and the man gets caught. As a seasoned hunter with over 50 years of experience under my belt, I've had my fair share of memorable moments in the wilderness. But this particular incident with my friend Jay, while hunting an elk during a heavy snowfall, remains one of the most baffling and unforgettable experiences of my life. It was a cold, overcast day with snowflakes as large as cotton balls gently descending from the sky, covering the landscape in a thick, white blanket. Jay and I had been tracking this particular elk for almost 4 miles. We were deep in the woods, far from any hint of civilization, a place where the silence was only broken by the crunch of our boots on the snow and the occasional distant cry of a bird. The elk's tracks were clear and fresh, leading us through the dense forest. As experienced hunters, we had a strategy in place. Jay would circle around, attempting to cut off the elk's path, while I followed directly behind the animal. If the elk were to break from the cover of the trees, we'd be ready. I remember the steam rising from the elk's fresh urine trails, a sign that we were closing in. My heart raced with anticipation. I had my gun ready, an extension of my years of experience and skill. I moved silently, every step calculated, every breath controlled. I was certain we were about to have a successful hunt. As I approached a clearing which I knew well from previous hunts, something odd happened. The elk's tracks, which had been so clear and distinct, suddenly just stopped. There was no sign of the animal, no additional tracks, no movement in the bushes, nothing. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and unnerving. Puzzled, I signaled Jay to conduct a sweep of the area, hoping he might discover where our elusive elk had vanished. We were both veterans of the woods, and such a sudden disappearance was highly unusual. Elk don't just vanish into thin air, especially not in such heavy snow. Jay completed his circle and returned, shaking his head. He hadn't found anything either. No tracks leading away, no signs of the elk doubling back. Nothing. It was as if the earth had just swallowed it whole. We stood there for a while, in the middle of that silent, snow-covered clearing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I've always prided myself on being able to read the signs of the forest, to track an animal through the toughest of conditions. But this was beyond my understanding. It defied everything I knew about hunting and the behaviors of elk. After a while, we decided to call off the hunt. There was no point in continuing when our prey had seemingly disappeared into thin air. As we made our way back, retracing our steps through the now heavy snow, we discussed the possible explanations. Could the elk have sensed us and changed course so dramatically that we missed it? Had it found a hiding spot so perfect that it remained concealed despite our best efforts? The mystery of the vanishing elk stayed with me long after that day. It became a story I would often recount, one that always ended with puzzled looks and shrugs. In all my years of hunting, I've come to expect the unexpected, to respect the unpredictability of nature. But this experience was something else, a reminder that no matter how skilled or experienced you are, the wilderness will always have its secrets, its unexplained mysteries that humble even the most seasoned of hunters. Last year, during a cold winter night, I was home alone, my parents having gone to visit my grandparents for the weekend. I wasn't new to being alone, but something about this night felt different, maybe because of the intense snowstorm outside. I had settled in the living room with a blanket, some hot cocoa, and a movie to keep me company. The house was warm and cozy, especially compared to the blizzard outside. I remember checking the locks on the doors and windows earlier, a habit my parents had instilled in me. As the night progressed, the wind's howling seemed to grow louder, almost like it was calling out. I tried to ignore it, but once you get these thoughts into your head while you're alone, it seems like they get worse. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just the tree branches against the window, but the tapping was too rhythmic, too intentional. I paused the movie, listening intently. The tapping continued, coming from the back door. My heart started to race. No one had any reason to be out there, especially not during a storm like this. I crept towards the kitchen, where the back door was located, trying to be as quiet as possible. Peeking through the curtains, I saw a figure standing outside. It was hard to make out details in the darkness and the blowing snow, but someone was definitely there. Panic set in. We lived in a remote area, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. I didn't know what to do. I remembered my phone and rushed to grab it, but then realized I had left it charging upstairs. As I turned to head upstairs, the tapping turned into a more aggressive knocking. I froze, my mind racing. Should I confront them? Hide? The decision was made for me when I heard the sound of glass breaking from the kitchen. Adrenaline kicked in, and I ran upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911.
911, what's your emergency?
I whispered into the phone, explaining the situation to the operator. They told me to stay on the line, and that help was on the way, but it might take time due to the storm. I crouched in the corner of my room, away from the door, listening to every sound in the house. I could hear footsteps downstairs, the sound of drawers being opened and closed. The intruder was searching the house. Tears streamed down my face as I realized how vulnerable I was. The operator's voice was a small comfort, assuring me that help was coming. Then, the footsteps started coming upstairs. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't try to enter my room. The footsteps stopped outside my door. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. There was a moment of silence, and then the handle on my door jiggled. I wanted to scream, but fear kept me silent. The intruder tried the handle a few more times before moving on. I stayed huddled in my corner, too scared to move, until I heard sirens in the distance. The footsteps hurried, moving back downstairs. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They found the back door broken and the house in disarray, but the intruder was gone, having fled into the storm when they heard the sirens. The police put a patrol car outside until my parents returned home. They never caught the intruder, but they believed it was someone looking for shelter from the storm and perhaps something to steal. That night changed me. The feeling of safety I had in my own home was shattered. It took a long time to feel comfortable being alone again, but eventually I got through it. I work night shifts at a gas station not too far from where I live. My hours are never the same, but most times I'm back home by early morning, between 2 and 5. On this particular night, after a long and tiring shift, all I could think about was getting home, jumping into bed, and sleeping. The drive back was challenging, It was snowing. I could barely see ahead of me, and the roads were covered with snow. I had to concentrate hard to stay awake and alert. Once I arrived home, I parked on the street in front of my house and went inside. I made my way upstairs, feeling the weight of the night on my shoulders. I remember falling onto my bed, and it felt so good just to lie down. I must have fallen asleep in no time. When I woke up, I was still really tired, maybe even more than before. I wasn't sure why I woke up in the first place. I looked out the window, and it was still dark and snowing, so I knew I hadn't slept long. But then, something weird caught my eye. The door of my bedroom was wide open. That's strange because I always sleep with it closed. I thought about it and couldn't remember closing it when I got home, but I was pretty sure I would have done it, even if I was super tired. Feeling a bit uneasy, I got out of bed and walked across my room. The rest of the house was dark and quiet, which only added to the weird feeling. I closed my bedroom door, and just as it clicked shut, I heard a noise. It was like something moving somewhere else in the house. It scared me, and I froze, listening for any other sounds, but there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably nothing, but I couldn't relax after that, so I opened my bedroom door again and decided to check around the house. I went to the next room, thinking maybe the noise came from there. It's just a simple room with a bed and a dresser. I looked around, but nothing was out of place. Just as I was about to go back to my room, I heard another sound, a door creaking open in the hallway. I peeked out and saw a man coming out of the closet. We looked at each other, and I knew I had seen him somewhere before, but I couldn't figure out where. I quickly went back into the room, locked the door, and heard him running down the stairs and out of the house. I waited a bit, then called 911. The police came and said there were no signs of someone breaking in. They thought maybe I left the front door unlocked. That seemed weird to me because I always lock it, but maybe I forgot to this time, since I was so tired. The scariest part was realizing I knew the man's face from somewhere but not knowing where. The idea that he was in my house, maybe even opened my bedroom door while I was asleep, was really creepy. He didn't take anything, which made it even more confusing. Maybe he recognized me too and changed his mind about whatever he was planning to do. Ever since then, I keep thinking about it, especially on snowy nights. It's hard to feel safe knowing someone was in your house and you didn't even know it. The whole thing just makes me feel uneasy, and I can't stop wondering why he was there and what he could have done. I'm a 24-year-old woman living in a small house near my job. Until recently, my life had been uneventful, and I never had any unusual experiences, but an incident that occurred changed my perspective on social interactions. My daily routine was typical: go to work, come home, make dinner, and relax with a TV show or movie. Since it was Friday, I planned to stay up a bit later than usual, although sometimes I'd fall asleep earlier than intended. That night, I turned on a movie around 8 and eventually dozed off on the couch. My sleep was abruptly interrupted by a sharp sound, a notification from my phone which I hadn't heard before. Startled, I picked up the phone from the coffee table, squinting against the bright screen. It was a message notification on Facebook, leading me to the Messenger app, which I rarely used. I opened the message, curious. It was from a man saying a simple hello. His name rang a bell, but he wasn't among my close friends. I clicked on his profile and noticed we had one mutual friend and had been connected on Facebook for 4 months. I vaguely remembered accepting his friend request, as my habit was to accept requests from anyone who shared mutual friends, given I didn't post anything too private online. I returned to the Messenger app and replied with a polite, "Hi," though it struck me as odd to receive a text so late at night. As soon as I sent the message, the man was quick to reply. His next message made me gasp and drop my phone on the table, my eyes darting to the window. He wrote, "I love that movie too. We should watch it together." The outside was dark and it was snowing heavily, so I couldn't see anything through the window, but I was shaking, realizing someone was watching me from outside. I felt deeply uncomfortable, not knowing how long they had been there. My phone beeped again with another message from him. I was too scared to read it, frozen in place, until the doorbell rang, causing me to jump with tears in my eyes from panic. I called 911, struggling to explain my situation through my tears and overwhelming fear. The operator advised me to lock myself in a room and wait for help, which was only 5 minutes away. As I hung up, my phone continued to beep with more messages from the man, now in all caps, demanding that I open the door. Then a chilling final message came through. "Never mind." Shortly after, I heard a soft bang from another part of the house. It sounded distant at first, but then another bang, louder this time, echoed through the hallway near the kitchen. I realized it was coming from the basement. I ran to my bedroom, hearing another loud bang and the sound of something breaking. I locked myself in, crying uncontrollably from fear, listening to the sounds of the man moving through the basement and then up the stairs. I always kept the basement door locked, but I feared the man would break through any minute. The doorknob rattled, followed by several forceful shoves against it. And then loud knocks sounded at the front door.
Police, open up!
I heard from the other side. I sprinted to the front door, unlocking it to let the 2 male officers in. They could see the panic in my eyes as I quickly pointed them towards the basement door, telling them he was in there. Guns drawn, they cautiously opened the door and went down. The intruder attempted to flee but was caught by the officers after a brief struggle. The man had broken in through the basement window. Astonishingly, he was the same man from Facebook, not using a fake account, but his real identity. His reasons for breaking in were unclear, merely claiming he wanted to talk. This experience was surreal, something I thought only happened in movies. I spent the following week cleaning up my friends list on Facebook, removing anyone I didn't personally know. It was a sad realization, but necessary in today's world to ensure my safety and privacy. I had been a bus driver for local schools for nearly 20 years before retiring and starting to drive city buses. While I loved driving kids around, as I grew older, I found it harder to keep up with their energy and chaos. Driving in the city was more stressful, but the bus lot was a mere 10-minute walk from my apartment, and the passengers mostly kept to themselves, which I preferred. At the city bus company, we had buses running around the clock. Not many drivers wanted the night shifts, so us day drivers were required to cover 2 night shifts every other week. These weren't too bad, except they threw off my sleep schedule. The roads were emptier and there were fewer passengers, making the job more relaxing compared to the daytime hustle. It was around 2 to 3 a.m. on a snowy December night, and the city was quiet. I had been driving my usual route for about an hour without a single passenger. Only a few people were out walking in the snow. I pulled up to the last stop of my route for a quick break, leaning back in my seat to rest my eyes, careful not to fall asleep. Suddenly, a loud knock at the door jolted me awake. An older man was standing outside looking in. I nervously smiled and opened the door. He scanned his bus pass and sat at the very back of the bus. I called out to him, offering to drop him off wherever he needed, but there was no response. I found it odd, but decided to keep driving, stopping at every bus stop along the route as usual. Throughout the drive, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The man just sat there, staring straight ahead. His behavior was strange, but at that hour, who knows what goes through people's minds? As I neared the last 2 stops, I wondered when he would get off. At the next stop, I looked back at him. After a brief pause, he got up, his gaze fixed on the floor. As he walked closer, I turned around, noticing his face was filled with anger and rage. I tried to act normally, but he stopped right next to me, staring down at me with an intense look. I nervously asked if everything was okay. He just stared, then walked back to his seat. I was genuinely scared now, sensing something was very wrong. I drove to the final stop, feeling a tension I couldn't quite describe. The man suddenly got up, quickly walked down the aisle, and shoved me against the window, pressing a gun against my head. His eyes were full of crazed anger. I couldn't understand his intentions, but I feared he would shoot. Without a word, he just screamed loudly in my face, then let go and walked out. I quickly closed the door and drove away, calling the police immediately. They tracked the bus pass he used, but the photo they showed me days later was of a completely different person. I couldn't fathom what was going through that man's mind or what he wanted from me. That encounter, on a quiet, snowy night, was the most disturbing and unsettling experience I'd ever had. It left me shaken, forever altering my perception of the night shifts and the unpredictability of the people you might encounter. I had been working the overnight shift at a fast food restaurant as the drive-through attendant for almost 3 years. I was a part-time college student with odd class hours, so these night shifts, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., made my life a lot easier. The job was generally slow, often dull, with a few customers trickling in at night. However, there were nights when strange things happened, particularly when I was alone. My regular co-worker, who usually shared these overnight shifts with me, was off for a vacation week. That left me solo for 3 nights out of my 5-night work week. The first 2 nights went by without any issues. They were typical, slow and manageable. But the 3rd night was different. That night, there was a snowstorm outside, with only a handful of customers showing up for small orders. Then, around 2 a.m., there was a long period of quiet. No one came through the drive-through for almost 45 minutes. During this lull, I kept my headset on in case any late-night customers arrived and started cleaning to pass the time. While cleaning, I noticed bright headlights through the front window. A car was parked right outside the doors. Our dining room closed at 9 p.m., so it was a bit unusual to see someone parked there. I thought maybe the driver was checking their phone or needed a quick stop. I continued cleaning, not giving it much thought. A few minutes later, my headset beeped. A customer was in the drive-through. I quickly went to the window, where a man's soft voice asked for a large soda. He pulled up to the window faster than expected, and I could see him glancing into the restaurant as I prepared his drink. It felt awkward, but I handed him the soda, took his exact change, and wished him a good night. After he drove off, I went back to cleaning. However, when I passed by the window a few minutes later, I was startled to see the same man still parked there, staring into the restaurant. I asked if he needed anything else, but he just said no and eventually drove away. It was unsettling, but I reminded myself that the restaurant was locked and secure. I resumed cleaning, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. soon there was another beep in the headset, but no one responded when I asked what they wanted. I checked the cameras and saw the same car behind the drive-through window, the man still inside. Feeling nervous, I stepped away from the window, out of sight but keeping an eye on the camera feed. After a minute of staring at the screen, the man suddenly pulled up to the window and started banging on it aggressively. Shocked, I backed away, watching as he then sped off to park in front of the main doors. He tried to force the locked front doors open. In a panic, I called 911, reporting the situation as the man struggled with the door. He gave up after a few attempts and drove off. The police arrived shortly after, ensuring I was safe and promising to investigate using the security footage. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of anxiety. I kept wondering about the man's intentions. Was he planning to rob the place, or was it something else? Being alone made me feel vulnerable, and I couldn't help but think about what could have happened if he had managed to get in. After that night, I was left with a lingering sense of fear during my shifts. The incident made me realize how exposed I was working alone at night. I wasn't sure if the man was caught, as I never received an update from the police. I used to work night shifts at a small convenience store in Michigan. The job was simple: stock shelves, handle the occasional customer, and keep the place tidy. It was a slow job, especially during winter nights when the snow piled high and the streets were mostly deserted. One such winter night, I was all alone in the store. It was past midnight, and the snowfall had turned into a blizzard. The whole town seemed asleep, the only sounds being the howling wind and the faint hum of the store's heaters. Around 1 a.m., while I was restocking some shelves, I heard the bell above the door ring. Expecting a late-night customer, I walked to the counter, but there was nobody there. I figured the wind might have blown the door open, so I went to check and found it securely closed. Shrugging it off, I went back to my work. A little while later, I heard a noise from the back of the store, like something had fallen. I got a bit startled, but I figured it was just a product that had toppled off a shelf. I walked to the back, but everything seemed in place. I had a look around, but I couldn't figure out what caused the sound. Feeling a bit uneasy, I returned to the counter, trying to shake off the feeling. The store was silent again, except for the storm outside. I started to feel really isolated and kind of anxious. As I was finishing up on the aisle, I suddenly heard footsteps. They were faint, coming from the back of the store. I got really freaked out, but I stayed silent, listening. I walked slightly toward the back and called out, "Hello, is someone there?" But there was no response, just silence, followed by more footsteps. I cautiously made my way towards the back. The store felt different, like I wasn't alone. I checked each aisle, but I found nothing. I thought I might be imagining things, the silence and isolation getting to me. As I turned back towards the front, the temperature seemed to drop suddenly. I could see my breath in the air. I quickened my pace, wanting nothing more than to be back at the well-lit counter. That's when I heard a loud bang from the storeroom. My heart was racing now. I knew I had to check it out, but every part of me wanted to just run out of there. I picked up my phone and turned on the torch. I approached the storeroom door. I pushed it open slowly, the beam from my phone cutting through the darkness. The room was a mess, boxes overturned, products scattered. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw footprints in the snow on the floor. They were leading to a small window at the back, which I then realized was slightly open, letting in the cold winter air and a whole bunch of snow from the blizzard. I understood then that someone had been in the store, hiding, walking around while I was stocking shelves. The thought sent chills down my spine. I quickly closed the window, locked the storeroom, and rushed back to the front. I locked the front door, too, and called the police. The police arrived within minutes, but after searching the area, they found no one. They said it was probably just a homeless person seeking shelter from the storm, but that didn't make me feel any better. The rest of the night, I stayed at the counter, too scared to move. Since that night, I've never felt comfortable working the night shift alone. Every little sound makes me anxious. I keep thinking about the footprints, the open window, and what could have happened. It was just an ordinary winter night at work, but it turned into something straight out of a horror story.
Back in my food delivery days, I had my fair share of strange encounters, but one night stands out as the weirdest of them all. I was working for DoorDash just after high school in order to make some extra cash. I enjoyed the job because it let me drive around and relax. I also liked the idea to be by myself for a while, as I lived with my parents and two brothers at the time. Most shifts went by pretty quick, and on some days I made good money from all the tips. One snowy winter night I was working late, and it was just after midnight when I decided to take one last order and call it a day. It was quite a big order, so I thought I might receive a good tip. I picked up the food from the restaurant and started driving. The roads were mostly empty and snowy. I jumped onto the highway and followed the app to where it said the place was. The address led me to an old rundown apartment building on the outskirts of town. I had never been in that part of town before, but it was one of those places that had seen better days. The apartment building looked old and withered. I parked on the street near the entrance, grabbed the food from my car, and entered the building. Immediately, I was hit by a lingering musty smell and the lights were flickering. I went up the stairs and headed to the third floor of the building, where the customer's apartment was located. I walked down a long, dark corridor where only one light bulb seemed to be working, but it was dim. When I reached the door, I could hear faint murmurs from inside the apartment. It sounded like multiple people were talking in hushed tones. I knocked, and everything immediately went silent. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but no one came to the door. I took my phone out to call the customer, but just as I was about to dial, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit apartment. A middle-aged man with messy hair and a worn-out bathrobe stood in the doorway. His eyes were red, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say a word, just extended a shaky hand to take the order. I told him the total, and he handed me a crumpled wad of cash. As I counted the money, I couldn't help but ask, "Is everything all right in there?" He hesitated for a moment, then mumbled something about having a family gathering, and abruptly closed the door. I turned to leave, but as I walked down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I reached the stairwell, I heard the door of the apartment burst open, followed by a chorus of voices raised in conversation. I froze in my tracks, debating whether to go back and check on the man. Before I could decide, the man reappeared at the door. He looked even more disheveled than before, and had a weird, terrified look in his eyes. This time he spoke more clearly.
"You need to get out of here, now."
I didn't need any further convincing. I bolted down the stairs in a hurry. As I reached the ground floor, I heard the man's frantic voice shouting at me from above.
"They're coming for you too!"
I left the building and ran through the snow back to where I had parked. I jumped into my car and sped away from that apartment building as quickly as I could. On the drive back, I felt unnerved and anxious. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I told my friends about the encounter the next day, and they said that it was probably just some crazy guy off his meds. While that may have been the case, I still can't figure out who all those people were in there with him, and why he seemed so distressed. I never found out who they were or what was going on in that apartment, and I never delivered to that address again. To this day, I can't help but wonder what I narrowly avoided that night. The encounter left me with more questions than answers, and a lingering sense of unease.